OLM Dev Working Group. It's July 16th, and we'll be going over the proposed agenda, and I believe Chris Johnson is the first person in the queue. So Chris, do you want to take over?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I just had a couple things here. So first of all, I wanted to call out that at the very top of the screen there, you've got the design discussions in the Google Drive. I've been asking for all of the behind the scenes documentation or discussions that have been happening with regards to dependency management and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so those are all there, at least a bunch of them, and that's awesome. So I've been taking a look at some of those things, and those have been super helpful for me to understand some of the thought processes behind some of the decisions that are being made. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at those. I'm assuming if you don't have access, then you're probably not part of the Google group. I'm not sure who to ask, maybe Alex, if you don't have access to that or for whatever. I just wanted to just call that out. The next thing I wanted to ask was, okay, so now that OpenShift 4.5 came out, OpenShift 4.5 now has a modern version of OPM being built in it. And it was strongly suggested that we use that version when we're building our catalog images and our bundles, because that version is much more supportable by Red Hat and others. And so I wanted to find out, as we took it apart and we took a look at it, and we're finding that the image is quite a bit different than the upstream one. So is there a recommendation on how this thing is supposed to be actually used?
Evan, do you want to take that one since you worked with OPM pretty closely?
I'd be happy to. I did just join about 30 seconds ago, so I'm not sure what the question is.
So the question is, now that OpenShift 4.5 has a modern version of OPM in its multi-arc images inside OSE, I've got the link on the screen there. We were told that we really should use that version for our catalog images that we're generating and for our bundle images, because those are supportable, not maybe directly supported since we're generating them ourselves, but they're more supportable from an OpenShift perspective. So what I'm wondering is, so we are using the Docker image to build the index. So we're basically using the OPM index or registry add to build the database. And then we're using the, because we need to build multi-arc images. And so, and then we're basically taking that database and we're using, building a Docker file to build the registry from that, the index from that thing. And so we're noticing that the OPM build for the Red Hat version of the image is completely different than the version that's in upstream. It's like the files inside of it are different. They're in different directory structures. Just wondering what is the right way we should be using or consuming that Red Hat operator registry image.
That's a good question. I'm not aware of any directory differences. There's definitely lots of content differences between the upstream and the downstream images. The OpenShift images have a lot more in them. So you'll see more directories. I don't believe you should see different directories, or at least I can't recall a change that would be the case. Can you think of an example?
Yeah, for example, in upstream, OPM is in the /bin/build directory, and then in the Red Hat is just in /bin. That's a real simple one.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that is different just based on the way that they're built. But those two images, well, I should also add that the registry image that is built for downstream contains all of the tooling, and then for upstream, we do build different images with different subsets of the tooling for different purposes. Right, yeah, exactly. Kevin's
so another thing we noticed. Yeah, another thing we noticed is that the downstream version is actually running the operator registry binary, and then upstream is running OPM with the registry flag.
Yep, those are differences without any real meaning right now. They both call into the same thing, and then we'll be updating the OpenShift version to call OPM registry serve as well. But they both call the same underlying.
Yeah. Yeah. If you go look at the source for the operator registry, there is a folder CMD, and then inside of that there's 5 different binaries. But all of those binaries are basically just a tiny bit of source code that uses Cobra to wrap certain commands, and then the underlying package it all comes from the same source otherwise. So that downstream image just has a bunch of binaries in it, and it also has a bunch of other tooling associated with them because of various different things related to the way that like OpenShift uses and consumes their registry project.
Right. So I guess really my question is, in order for us to run with the downstream image, we had to reverse engineer it to figure out how it was run because it's different than the upstream. Upstream, it's very clear that you can build those images all sorts of different ways through Docker files, through OPM directly. And from the OpenShift documentation, it really just talks about just using OPM to do it. So is it okay if we're using, is it supported if we're basically reverse engineering and doing it the upstream way, but on the downstream images?
So I think that our intention as soon as we can is to release OPM as a binary directly. We have been going through a pretty extensive process to get that actually to happen in the OpenShift organization of like release process. So it just hasn't happened yet. In I think the supported or the expected way, I think there's somewhere in the docs that describes this. What we're expecting users to do for now is to actually pull the binary of OPM out of that container image for the registry. And so like the binary itself should be otherwise functionally identical to how you guys use it upstream. And that's sort of what we're expecting and what we're expecting to support.
Yeah, but what I'm talking about is I'm talking about this hybrid thing where we're actually building the Docker image ourselves rather than using OPM index add, because OPM index add is really slow.
So 2 questions. Well, so first off, I think the answer is yes, because those are also if you're using OPM registry add or using OPM index add with the -- generate flag, it's more or less the same source code. So we're going to be supporting either of those things. So my question is, when you say it's really slow, what do you mean?
If I use OPM index add, and under the covers, what is that doing? That's basically downloading an image, extracting it, modifying the database, packaging it back up. We're doing all those steps ourselves because we're finding we've got those bugs having to do with default channel ordering problems and stuff like that. So we're instead just doing a whole bunch of OPM registry adds just to build the database. And then we go ahead and slap that into the actual index image because it's like a lot faster that way. And we don't have that same problem where we can add each registry or each bundle independently and preserve the correct order for the default bundle. Not sure if you remember that bug or not, but there's that bug where if you pass the array of bundles, the last one doesn't always win.
Yeah, so I think that's something we definitely need to probably more actively triage. I pulled that issue down like 2.5 weeks ago and started looking at it, and then got distracted with things, and then I have not had time to pick it back up. But to answer your higher level question of like, is OPM registry add supported? The answer is definitely yes. Even within Red Hat, we have a bunch of teams who are doing lots of different things with OPM, and like, oh, I need to use Builda to build my image, so I need to like stage the database or whatever. Right. All of that is like kind of within the supported path of like how we're expecting users to interact with OPM.
Yeah, the other reason we're doing this is also because we need multi-arc registry images.
Yep.
So, and that's not there yet for upstream. Okay, so
as long as you, sorry. I was just going to say that the support is really, if you're using the tooling released with a minor version of OpenShift, then as long as you're building an image that serves the registry API in the right way, that should be supported.
Yeah.
More generally, when we say supported, what is the best thing for us to do when we run into bumps with OPM? GitHub issues in the operator registry repo, or is there a better channel?
GitHub issues are definitely the first line of defense. If it's something OpenShift specific, you can open a Bugzilla. That will also get eyes on it.
Okay, thanks.
So, okay, so related to that then, I've noticed that the OPM version that's actually shipped by Red Hat is kind of a hybrid-y version. It reports that it's 1.12.3, but when I look at the commits, it looks like some that's been cherry-picked from all sorts of the different things. So I'm a little concerned over what version that actually is.
Yep, that's a bug. So our upstream release process is slightly manual at the moment. We have this OPM version string that we actually use to define that version. We ingest that file when we're compiling.
Right.
And for upstream, when we were doing, I think the 12.4 build, 1.12.4, we didn't bump that number because it was a manual process to create a PR to update that. I think we probably can modify it. But if you're talking about the downstream, to be fair, if you're talking about the downstream image, if you run OPM version on that thing, the part you should care about is the commit. I don't believe that because we don't have an official release process separately for that binary, there is no downstream version number at all, right? So like the only way for you to actually know exactly what's in that downstream binary is to look at the commit ID and then compare that to the source. Because that number is almost certainly not going to line up directly with a specific upstream version. It's just whatever is latest source at the time it was compiled when that version of OpenShift was released.
Yeah, that makes it challenging to figure out exactly what version we're messing with. It'd be helpful, I guess, if in the release notes or something, when the erratas are coming out, if you could just kind of say which PRs are in there, just to make it a little easier for everybody. So
when you say that, the errata, so the downstream errata actually does have this, right? Like what you can do is to actually find out this information is look at the image that you pulled the binary from. That should match with a specific version of OpenShift. And if you look at the OpenShift release notes, that should have, like if it's a Z stream, so 4.4. whatever, go look at that specific version of 4.4.11 or 4.4.12. You should be able to see exactly what is committed into that in terms of like specific commits added to the registry.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. It can be a little challenging trying to figure out the lingo that ties the two together with English features. So I get it, and I've heard this before, and it is possible to do. It's just difficult. Okay, I think maybe our job would be to, on behalf of my constituents, which a lot of these guys are on the calls, try to figure out translate these to English and features, and then just publish it internally for ourselves. Okay. Okay, so then the next one I had was we're having have you guys thought about, so clearly we've thought about inception and how you install and discover operators, and now we've got we had the GVK dependent operator install, and now we've got the operator and version install, dependency install. What about uninstall? It appears that, when you install stuff, that's great, but when you uninstall stuff, of course, CRDs get left behind, the dependent operators get left behind. I know it's a hard problem to solve. I'm just wondering if there's been any plans to start thinking about that, rather than saying to a customer, these are all the things that we installed. If you do an uninstall it, these are all the things left behind. It's not at your own risk whether you delete these things or not.
So I know we've discussed internally at some points the idea that there should be a way for an operator to clean up after itself, and the cluster admin should be able to configure it to do just that. Kevin, do you know where we ended with that?
So, a couple things here. The first one is part of the problem is just specifically the way that CRDs are cluster scoped and with the way that they manage state. So one is the cluster scoping problem, which is just because I have an operator that runs against this CRD does not mean that there's not another operator installed on the cluster using the same CRD. So uninstalling just that one operator does not necessarily mean I'm the only owner of this CRD. That's not an unsolvable problem, right? Like, for example, OLM could be aware of all of the operators, assuming that OLM is the only thing that installed operators on the cluster. OLM could be aware of like, oh, hey, I'm the only thing that installed the CRDs. I could probably figure out that, hey, there's only one version of this operator that's touching this CRD. If I uninstall it, I can probably reasonably, assuming the operator says I can, go and also remove the CRD on like quote unquote uninstall. The second problem is a problem of cluster state. Say I'm a developer for a database operator. I go and build Postgres, and I have a CR or a CRD that says, give me a Postgres database. A cluster admin is going to have a really weird experience of, oh, I installed this operator. I used it to create my Postgres version 9 database. Then, oh, I actually don't want this operator anymore. I'm going to uninstall the operator. It, in order to remove the CRD, also removes the CR, which also deletes the database. Like that is a user experience problem that we haven't really totally solved yet. So we definitely have real users who doing something like that would be basically catastrophic for them.
Yeah, totally get that.
So that being said, I think we have had some conversations about something like an opt-in, where basically an operator author could say, "Hey, I actually want when you delete my operator to, I'm doing like basically stateless things. When you uninstall my operator, I want it to be fine for that to automatically clean up all the CRs and delete the CRD, and then delete my operator." But I think we haven't gotten much past that as like that could be something that we could build. I don't think that there's no detailed design doc of like how exactly that would work.
Yeah, okay. I was just kind of curious if you guys had thought about this. I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of these problems too. So I think for the customers, then we're going to have to basically describe, or they're going to have to be fundamentally aware of the internals of how these things work, and so they know that if they really want to clean up their systems, these are the resources they need to look at, and this is the exercise they need to do to see if that's going to break anything if they do that. It seems like there could be some automation around there to help that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think being able to bubble up the scope of like, if you do this, here's what actually gets removed. That could be step one towards an option of like -- force, where essentially we say like, or the cluster admin, instead of having to run 4 or 5 different steps, can just go through OLM, even though he knows that, oh, hey, look, there's all of these things that it's going to do. Are you sure you actually want to go and do that? I think that's another UX that is possible. I think in general, though, most of the problems around building something like this are more or less UX related, as opposed to something fundamental about Kubernetes that would prevent us from going and building it.
So as far as, have you developed any feature plans for this yet? Or is that it's just been kind of like internal discussions and pushed on the priority list because we were more interested in getting stuff installed versus uninstalled?
There have been a couple of discussions that I think we should probably follow this conversation up with starting an enhancement and just sort of hashing out some of the ideas. But just some of the ideas we've thrown around have been opting into this deletion would have OLM finalize all your objects, and then you as an operator would put finalizers on all your CRs that you need to finalize, and then on a delete request, your operator would be signaled in some way or another to start cleaning things up, or OLM would start deleting all your CRs automatically if you've opted into this, and that triggers your finalization to clean up whatever needs to be cleaned up. Once all that's gone, once all the CRs are gone, OLM unfinalizes all your operator resources and so on. That's just one potential workflow, and I'm not sure that we've sussed out that makes sense for all cases, but we should just write it down and start discussing it, I think.
Okay, I'm taking notes in the agenda here while we're talking. Okay, the last one I had to do with, so we've had this problem. So in 4.4 and 4.3 of OCP, there was a a breakage between having bundle versions of registries versus bundleless registries. And so that's basically causing us to create two different catalogs, one with and one without. And so do you guys anticipate, from a defensive perspective, do you anticipate that we should design our catalogs to continue creating catalog versions per version of OpenShift? I know you're trying to come up with designs that have, the gRPC API is pretty stable, but I'm seeing things in the future that sound like they're going to break it. I know, like registry v1 versus registry v2 without the CSVs and stuff. I'm just kind of thinking if we should be doing something from a defensive nature, or should we just kind of 4.4 and on, the bundle-oriented registry catalogs are good. Am I clear on my ask?
I think so. This is another thing we've been discussing that we need to just write down, which is we probably need some form of content negotiation between catalogs and OLM, so that a catalog can say, I contain registry v1 bundles and registry v2 bundles, and OLM will reach out and say, I only support v1 bundles, so I don't know how to talk to you, so I'm going to stop. And I think we potentially have something along those lines for the new dependency types, like a registry saying, these are the dependency constraint types I know about, versus OLM knowing which things it can read. So those are definitely issues. The safest thing right now, because we don't have the content negotiation, would be to tie a catalog to a minor version of OpenShift if you're targeting OpenShift. If not, the changes are generally backwards compatible. We try not to make breaking changes that would affect something being brought forward.
All right, so you're recommending defensive implementation here.
That is what we're doing with OpenShift catalogs.
Yep. Well, one thing to keep in mind too is that while the registry should be backwards compatible, in the sense that newer versions of the registry image more than likely will work with older versions of OpenShift, it's not necessarily always the case, and we are talking about, like, what about in, for example, what about in the reverse, where it's like a newer version of OLM talking to an older registry? In that case, like, it's more likely that you're going to have compatibility issue. Like, for example, if OLM starts querying for, to use the same example, like OLM now queries for extra fields like the bundle path, like the place where the actual bundle was pulled from. Really old versions of the registry just don't have that field, and so it'll throw an error, right? And so I think one of the things that is also possibly or probably on the table is like having some kind of dependency matrix of or supportability matrix of, like, these versions of this work with these versions of that, similar to the way the Cube does. Like, APIs are guaranteed to work across 4 versions and like that sort of thing. But
Well,
for
have you
now,
guys thought about because of that? Have you thought about adding the ability to add multiple image references into a catalog source, so it pulls the correct one based on the version of OCP or based on label or something like that? So I don't have to have all this conditional logic to say if I'm running on OCP 4.5, use this catalog image. Kind of like how market multi-arc images kind of work under the covers, but it would have to be something a little higher level.
yeah, I'm not sure that we've like actively thought about trying to solve these problems at a really high level. I think in general we think about catalogs as sort of like these immutable content streams, and like you think like the metaphor we like to use a lot is we like to say that like OLM catalogs are kind of like a Yum repository, where like if you look at Yum repos, there are Yum repos associated with specific versions of Fedora, and in that way, like the Fedora content gets generated for a specific version of Fedora, and that those are not necessarily swappable just because of like compatibility. And even if you have, right, even if you have the metadata associated with like driving the catalog itself actually be compatible, you're still not guaranteeing that the version of the underlying system that you're on, whether that be a Fedora or that's Kubernetes, can actually support the content that is actually being hosted, right? And so because if the content itself needs to be negotiated like that anyway, what like I don't know that it necessarily is like the best value in terms of making sure that like every single version of the registry forever could work with any version of Cube.
Yeah. Not super happy with that answer, but okay. So what I would really like to see is OLM support older versions of the registry, right? Because it can, right? So I think having that version capability is super important to be able to do that, because this is going to be really expensive. So as you know, we're building up an Uber catalog, kind of like the Red Hat Marketplace catalog. We're building our own version, which is going to have hundreds of products in it. And it's going to be really expensive for us to keep lots of those around, because we basically going to have to keep a floating window of at least 3 versions around, and probably more, because we're going to have customers who are going to be stuck on out of service OpenShift versions just because they can't physically move off quick enough or something. And of course, once the long-term service release comes out, then we'll have at least over a year, or at least a year for that one version.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, okay, so if you use a single version of your catalog to store all this content, how, like on the client side, what do you tell customers who want to install packages that just won't actually ever work with?
The packages, right? So ideally, and I swear I saw something in a feature request where you were going to add metadata to the package, or at least the CSV that announced, well, you already know what versions of Kube are supported.
So
right?
that's not totally true, right? We have MinCube version.
Okay.
Which the MinCube version just means you need to be on at least this version of Kubernetes, or else you can't install this package, right? But like what we don't have is we don't have any equivalent to like MaxCube version, or like we don't have a version range of like you're only supported on this set of versions. For this is a problem kind of fundamentally with the packaging, right? That like in Cube 122, V1 Beta 1 CRDs just that we will not be supported anymore. That API won't exist, and you won't be able to apply them to a cluster anymore. At the moment that happens, every single one of the operators that exists right now that aren't already moved up to V1, you just won't be able to install them.
but in that particular case, you can always have your dependency APIs and stuff like that, which would block that. So are you considering having some kind of like a semver range for kube versions and OCP versions? So you can bound it?
That seems pretty reasonable, but it does seem to me like something you wouldn't necessarily want to tie to a particular already released package. You wouldn't want to have to go re-update your Cloud Pak released bundle, right? You kind of want that to be a property of the index itself that says this bundle is supported on this range of things. So you can go update it as you learn new information.
No, I totally agree with that. It should be, we need more package metadata, which we've discussed several times too, which would be really handy to have at that level. So again, this sounds like this might be something for another enhancement request.
It does, yeah, but it sounds really reasonable. I don't know if you took a look at some of the docs that Nick shared after the last meeting. But
Yeah,
I've
I'm
definitely
halfway
been thinking
through
about, yeah, it's a lot there. But some of the ideas are around sane ways to layer metadata onto the index over time, so that you could do things like adjust the properties of a package and track that.
I think I did run across somebody mentioned having an OCP version in there too. Was that included in that, or did I see that in the wrong spot? It seems weird to have OCP specific things in a non-OCP spec, but it would be handy for me.
So if you're looking, sorry, go ahead, Evan.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, if what you're actually looking for is OpenShift specific changes, I
want to prevent my operator from installing on anything less than 4.4.
Yeah. So in that case, I was just going to say is we have the operator framework enhancements repository. That's for just generically stuff that's supported with Cube. There is also an OpenShift enhancement repo, which is probably like the place for requests and enhancements like that.
I'm just wondering if you guys remember adding or seeing that. I swear I saw that someplace.
Yeah, we've definitely had that as a motivation for bundle metadata at one point. Things that we might want to do.
Yeah.
I think we're building towards that, and I think so. One of the things, I don't think we're ready to really present it here. It's still in progress, but over the next couple of weeks, we'll be probably merging our new dependency resolver. And there's a lot of opportunity to build on top of that, features like we're talking about now. So things like having properties of bundles that match properties of clusters somewhat more generically, which might make this detecting the OCP version not so OpenShift specific if it's done more as like a property of a cluster and it happens to have the property that it has a particular OCP version.
Okay. All right, I'm done taking notes. So I think those are all my questions. I think it took the majority of the time, so I'm sorry.
No worries. That was great conversation to have. I saw that Sam Hawker posted an issue on the agenda, so perhaps we should move to him next.
Perfect.
I'm going to link the issue.
Shall I just explain it, or do you guys want a few moments to read over it?
Yeah, it may be useful just for people that are watching this recording later for you to just share your screen on the issue and go over it.
Sure, absolutely. If I can figure out, yeah. Can people see my screen now?
Yep.
Yep.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah. So I work alongside Dale Lane, who's also in this call. Recently, we were playing around with the idea of a pulse. So naturally in development, it would be really useful, you deploy everything and then you go, I really want to change something, but we have periodic reconciles, so it happens like every 60 seconds. So for instance, if I change something in, say, the deployment, it'll get bounced back. And so we thought the idea of being able to have a dedicated field in a custom resource called something like pulls reconcile, or that I have a variety of names here, unmanaged, ignored, ignore changes, etc. But the idea is if we go through a reconciliation loop, we should basically do nothing and just leave. And it's considered like paused, and it could have additionally things like paused in its status.conditions field. But the general idea is once a CR has been pulled, the operator will not manage any of the resources. Not only is this useful for development, but for cases of support. For instance, if we have a sort of a scenario where we need to do some manual intervention on some of the resources, persistent volumes, etc., need to do some sort of manual migration, having some like a sort of get out jail free card of being able to just pause the whole operator's function would be great, just that it doesn't interact with the system and perhaps revert things when we don't want them reverted, or basically change anything. Does such a mechanism already exist? Myself and Dale have done some digging into whether these concepts already exist. For instance, the Prometheus operator has already got an example of this, but couldn't really find any other examples. And I did some searching in Kubernetes and Operator SDK, and I couldn't really find anything discussing these topics. So I was just wondering if you guys had any opinions on this.
Yeah, Alex.
So this seems to be slightly more of an SDK problem. The main goal of this meeting is to discuss OLM concepts. I do see that Eric S is on. Eric, do you have any strong opinions here?
I mean, not particularly. I wonder if there's like a better way to solve this with current primitives, but I'm not really sure. I haven't had the chance to really look through this super hard just yet. Sorry.
Yeah, for example, what if we like a technique I use, for example, for Cincinnati is just to turn off all the replicas and basically shut off the operator temporarily. But would that turn on other features you need?
Yeah. So that is one solution. But say if you have an operator managing multiple instances and you don't want to lose that management, by reducing the replicas of the operator down to 0, or uninstalling the operator, or basically removing the permissions of the operator to do anything in the system, all of these have effects on potentially other operands. And we were wondering if there was any sort of prior art in this, or thoughts, or whether this has been experimented with and thought to be wrong, etc. Just hoping to get some feedback on this, essentially.
Can I ask what is the actual use case for this? Like what is the purpose of doing it?
So we have a list up here, sorry, of potential use cases. So if we want to make unsupported changes to the instance, so for instance, say if we haven't allowed a user to override, say, the liveness probe of a certain component within the operand, we could pause the reconciliation, actually override the liveness probes there. You've got other things that you might want to change, change the logging level of a certain component, and you haven't exposed any way to configure this via the custom resource. Essentially, anything that you couldn't configure via the custom resource or wouldn't want to, this would allow you to do it. You've also got, support scenarios, manual migration tasks. If you want to have a controlled shutdown, if you just want to scale everything down to 0 and your operator doesn't have any concept of being able to do that right now, this is a way of doing it.
So some of the sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I just want to speak up real quick about this. I haven't had to look through this in the depth, anything like that. But from what I see in the Prometheus, it's essentially that they're having a spec field, basically look like almost like a label in the CR, and then the operator, the controller, check for that and go ignoring that when they see their pause label and continue to go on with other CR that do not have this field. It seems like a rather general approach and solution for this. What do you think about that specific
So I think the
method?
description is true. I think essentially what Sam's asking is for feedback on, is that generally a good idea? And if it is a good idea, would it be worth making that into what the operator SDK generates so that other operators can start adopting this kind of pattern in a consistent way?
Oh, I see. So you want to see if that specific parent is actually something can be done
like is
on
there a
the
sensible pattern to adopt, or is there a better way that this should be done, or are there potential problems we're not foreseeing with adopting this pattern?
Yeah, I first of all, I don't think scaling an operator out is a good solution. Like if you literally shut down the operator just because you want to do some manual changing on a CR, to me that doesn't sound like a good thing to do. But if you can make sure the CR in question, the CR you want to do some manual editing, is not being reconciling, then you need to do something, basically a unit identifier that your controller can check for, and ignoring that during the reconciliation process. To me, that seems like a rather common pattern to do. Like, I try not to think of example in the top of my head right now. It's just like something you want to disable, you flag it up on the field somewhere, like forwards, like similar like node selection, for example. When the node is not able to scheduling, I think they're one of the few or some label or some annotation where marking that it's unhealthy or something like that, and they're just ignoring that node and we're not scheduling any part in that node. So that is just basically the similar concept, I think. Does that make sense?
I'll build on that a little bit. So on a more fundamental level, like when you have a controller like this, you don't necessarily want to pause it. You like need to build in like all of the possible scenarios into the controller itself where like you might need to do maintenance or whatever and not stop the controller ever.
Yeah.
To do so is like definitely a failed like controller scenario and probably related to a bug. So like on a like theoretical level, like no, this is probably not a good idea and might actually be masking bugs in the controller itself that you should probably fix. Now I like, once again, I'm sure there's a way to get the functionality that you want on maybe a per operator basis using some sort of like, node taint, or I don't really know what you can possibly do, but yeah, I think there are ways to solve this on a per operator basis that don't necessarily involve adding a new spec field to like pause the entire controller.
It's not about pausing the entire controller though. It's pausing the controller's functionality for a single custom resource.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair statement. It's just, it's a similar thing and can still mask bugs in the controller itself that should just be fixed. I'm not completely saying no to this. I'm just saying that there needs to be a lot of discussion around how this is implemented, if it's going to be implemented at all. And I haven't seen much response on the issue itself. I think now that we're talking about it, I'll bring it up to some other SDK folks to take a look at it and see what they say as well.
Yeah, that would be just super useful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, would the operator SDK issues like this be best brought up on the Monday calls?
Probably on the monthly call. If we have time. Well, okay, so let me walk that back a little bit. So the Monday calls are for issue triage, and this is an issue in the SDK. So yes, it will be addressed and discussed. That particular call is more for like assigning labels and assigning people to deal with particular issues. So probably not the best like long form discussion for this, but I think we will talk about, well, we definitely will talk about this on Monday. And then for the August monthly meeting, please put this on the agenda. I'll link the project page for that, so you can add get the agenda link and add it to that.
Yeah, and I'll update the documentation for the agenda just to make it clear where we should discuss more of the SDK questions versus the OLM questions, so it's clearer in the future.
Yeah, I think it'd be great at the top of our agenda here just to kind of say what this is scoped for, because it's OLM and it's OPM, right? The registry, at least those two things.
Yeah, and catalog operator if you count it as a separate thing as well.
I do have a question on this. I know we're not meant to be talking about the SDK stuff, but I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of the operator SDK pushing anything into the spec of a created CRD right now at all. Am I right or wrong in that assumption?
Sorry, when you say push,
Well,
do you mean
push is probably the wrong terminology, but there's no default properties in a CRD spec, created CRD spec when you create one through the operator SDK right now. Is that true?
well, I haven't looked in a while, but my assumption is that the answer is that you are correct.
Okay.
Eric can probably speak to it better.
I mean, yeah, like typically you're just updating the status and making sure that the spec matches the expected spec. So like, yeah, you could update the spec within the controller itself.
Right, but just to be clear with Sam's proposal here, the proposal by adding this to the operator SDK is every instantiated CRD would have this by default in the spec. Is that the proposal?
Yeah, pretty much, or at least a guideline that would be recommended, right? A recommended field.
Okay. I have my own thoughts on this. I'm going to hold off on it because it's probably not the right place to talk about it. Yeah. I'm not on the SDK or the OLM team, by the way, just so you know.
I was just going to mention that for some of the use cases that are listed out, it's a little easier to use the pattern that like the deployment controller uses in Kubernetes, where you stamp out the digest of or hash of the spec you calculated, and then just compare that again rather than comparing spec fields. That can give you the freedom to modify things that your controller doesn't care about without needing to list out every single field and check every single field. So that might be something we think about for SDK as well.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we're at the top of the hour. And I don't think we should start triaging issues now because I don't think we'll get through any more. Is there anything anyone would like to visit before we sign off? Okay, on that note, I'm going to stop recording, and I appreciate everybody coming here today. Thank you.